Sup everyone, it's episode 3 of this thing I'm doing that you're watching that has no official title as of yet. Not that anyone cares, but I have thought of a title for these videos. It's actually something I thought up a very long time ago, oddly enough, but I like that name I came up with so much, I've held on to it for so long, that now I don't want to use it unless I know that it's being used on something that deserves it. Like, in my head, these videos have to work up to the stature of that name in order for me to feel justified in deploying it. Which I know sounds incredibly stupid and pointless, but I don't know, it's just how I roll. I have a bad habit of sometimes saving things and setting them aside for special occasions, and then never getting around to enjoying them, because I'll push them off forever instead of getting to them immediately. Which is why there are things in my Netflix queue that have been there for years that I will almost certainly never watch, even though I've deemed them worthy of watching. It's one of the many neurotic quirks I have that make me who I am. And it's why I may never get around to actually naming these videos. But we'll see. Anyway, in the last video, I was discussing Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, and much like that movie, my review of it was a little polarizing. Not a lot of commenters agreed with me that they liked the film, and it doesn't seem that hardly anyone liked it more than I did. I'm sort of on an island when it comes to that. But that's cool. We're all entitled to our opinions when it comes to entertainment. I think for me, if I had to surmise the disconnect that people have with The Last Jedi, while acknowledging that some people probably just don't like it as a film regardless of its fandom, it's that Rian Johnson made the least Star Wars-y Star Wars movie to date. And me personally, I didn't mind that, because I'd seen the 7 previous iterations of this series that had already given me the things that the diehards wished were in this movie. So I didn't need to see those things repeated for an 8th time. Like, I didn't need to see another Death Star. I didn't need to see another lightsaber duel on the bridge of a spaceship. I was happy that the movie branched out and took risks and tried to extend what can happen in a Star Wars movie. But I can also appreciate that if you went into this movie with a proverbial checklist of Star Wars-y things that you wanted to get out of it, then yeah, it makes sense that you were underwhelmed, because it's not as diligent to get to that checklist as much as the previous films were. That being said, I will maintain my belief, however presumptuous it might seem in the moment, that Star Wars fans will, in time, overwhelmingly come around to accept this movie as a respectable addition of the canon. Which is not to say, by the way, that the fans will all suddenly love it and go, you know what, we were wrong, silly me, this movie's amazing. No, a lot of the fans who don't like it will continue not liking it. It's hard to get fans to change their minds sometimes, especially when they're this passionate about it. But I know for a fact that there are also a lot of Star Wars fans who didn't like the prequels and who did not like parts of Return of the Jedi, such as the part where a bunch of teddy bears defeat the evil Empire, or the part where Boba Fett falls down some sand and gets eaten. And yet, they're still able to sit down and enjoy those films. Star Wars fans, from my experience, have generally been able to compartmentalize their major complaints of those movies, if they have any, from their ability to still watch them and get something out of them. Which is why, even if the fan base never fully comes around to embracing what happened to Luke, or what happened to Snoke, or anything else that happened in the movie, I fully believe that the fans will find, eventually, that they're still capable of sitting through it and enjoying much of it, a la Return of the Jedi. And they'll acknowledge, perhaps begrudgingly, that while it might not be their favorite entry in the saga, it's not the franchise killer that some are making it out to be. It doesn't make a mockery of the source material any more than Ewoks did, or Jar Jar Binks did, or Han Not Shooting First did, or the Roger robots did, or even the Star Wars Christmas special did. Even if you despise The Last Jedi, it's nothing more than one bad experience in a very long franchise that's still there. It's not like the original films have been destroyed. Like Luke Skywalker's Wikipedia page about all the great things he did in the original movies, it still exists. It's just longer now, and has an official entry into how he died that most fans don't like, even though I thought it was kind of cool. He faded into dust. That's how I want to die. I want to evaporate. But moving on, there was something that caught my attention when I was looking at the comments on that last video, which was that some people admitted that they didn't know quite how to react to The Last Jedi when they first saw it. There were some things they liked about it and some things they didn't, and that it wasn't until they looked at other people's reactions to it that they concluded that it wasn't for them. And I found that interesting because it reinforces my belief that more often than not, we, and I'm including myself here, don't normally have ironclad, unshakable opinions on the majority of the entertainment we experience. It's actually kind of rare that you'll watch something or play something and be completely 100% enthusiastic about it one way or the other. Because most of the time, we're living near the middle when we consume stuff. Because most stuff is average more than it's amazing or horrible. You might dislike a movie, but usually not enough that you'll hate it. And you might like a movie, but usually not enough that you'll need to see it a second time. More often than not, we're never that far away from potentially doing a 180 on something if someone makes a compelling counter-argument about it. Because nobody is capable of having impenetrable convictions on everything they come across. Or at least nobody that I know. It isn't until you become a fan of something that you feel the need to hold on to it and reject people who feel the opposite about it. I was thinking about this because on the internet, and on YouTube especially, it can be rare sometimes to find a review of something where someone admits that they don't know how to feel about it, that they're wishy-washy about it. Obviously, we're all inclined to have opinions on things one way or another, but it's also not uncommon to have conflicting opinions and to have trouble sifting through them, and maybe going back and forth and never really figuring out how you judge it or rank it if you'd have to. And yet on YouTube, where people live in the extremes, where sometimes it feels like every review is about how something is the worst thing ever or the best thing ever, you don't see displays of ambivalence that often. And maybe that's because there's a certain vulnerability that comes with presenting an opinion that isn't a hot take. There probably are a lot of people who watched The Last Jedi who had mixed feelings about it, who have since moved off their initial viewpoints, and maybe that's because they noticed that those viewpoints weren't being well represented. In the present, everyone is either destroying the film or lavishing it. So it stands to reason that if you're going to assimilate someone's commentary on the film, if you find yourself agreeing with someone, you too will probably wind up either really, really liking it or thinking it was total trash. And I'm no help in that regard either, since, as you know, I said I really liked the movie. So, with that in mind, I thought it would be cool to review something that I'm genuinely unsure about and go back and forth on whether it's good or not, which is why I'm reviewing the thing that I am today. But before I get into what that thing's about, let me first pose this question to anyone who's watching this. What is the movie or show or game or podcast or whatever that you are totally conflicted about, that you can't seem to quit even though there are things about it that you hate? Like, you'll be telling someone about all the reasons why you think it's garbage and why they should stay away from it, and yet you yourself can't seem to abandon it. One minute you'll be thinking about how terrible it is, and then the next thing you know, you're watching it or playing it or listening to it again, and you can't exactly explain why. Because you know it has problems, you know it's flawed, but it also has a lot of pluses, and those pluses are really good. And it's hard to reconcile that with the fact that it also bothers the crap out of you. Here's what that thing is for me. It is a 13-episode anime from 2013 called The Flowers of Evil. And it is one of the strangest shows I have ever seen, as you might expect from something called The Flowers of Evil. Everything about this show is radically different from virtually every other anime you could ever watch, including the fact that there's nothing supernatural about it, which is both a positive and a negative, and occasionally both at once. Right off the bat, if you watch this, and you owe it to yourself to at least take a glance at the first episode just to experience it, the first thing you'll notice is that the animation is really weird. It utilizes something called rotoscoping, which is the act of taking real-life footage and tracing drawings over everything in paper, frame by frame, in order to make it look like a moving cartoon. In other words, what the producers of The Flowers of Evil did, instead of sketching it from scratch, is they hired a bunch of actors and had them play out everything in the show in real-life locations that are just like the ones in the story, and then they had the animators go back and add a layer of artwork on top of that footage to make it resemble an anime show. It's a really bold choice, and it's one that you hardly ever see in entertainment because it can be an extremely tedious process to put together, where you have to essentially make two versions of the same thing. But it gives the show a really distinctive style if you can get used to it, which is maybe more of a challenge than it should be. One of the downsides of the rotoscoping here is that the characters all look distorted. They all look frumpier than they should. It's like if you ever watch an old show that's been vertically stretched so that it can fit a 16:9 aspect ratio without pillar boxing. It's kind of like that. The tracing of the characters and their facial features is very loose at times. There are moments where the characters' eyes and mouths will suddenly disappear for a split second, or where their voices won't match their lip flaps when they're talking. And in general, everyone moves at a slower pace than they would in a normal show. It's as though there was a drop in frame rate that occurred when the transition was made from live action to animation, because nothing is presented quite as smoothly as it would if it was in any other show. However, there is a trade-off to all this. If you can get past how freaking bizarre everything looks at first, there is an artistic vision here that the animation accompanies, and it's one of the best parts about the Flowers of Evil. This show is a psychological drama following the lives of middle school kids, in particular, a very depressed, socially awkward kid named Kasuga. And the people who created this show wanted to make this setting feel as realistic as humanly possible, as a way to augment the inner turmoil that this kid is going through. And so, they set out to capture all the normalities and casual moments of this kid's everyday life so that he comes across to us as a three-dimensional person who we can identify as having a life that's not so far removed from our own, even if we don't necessarily agree with what he's doing. And it works almost to perfection, for me. One of the main reasons why this is a niche show is that it's really, really slow. The Flowers of Evil doesn't edit out the mundane events that Kasuga encounters on a day-to-day basis, and it doesn't speed up conversations. You know how if you normally watch a TV show, everything is condensed? Entire meetings and interactions can be over in a couple minutes because people are talking so deliberately? That's not the case here. There are long stretches in this show where you just see him walking to school, or just see him staring out a window, or just watch him eat at the dinner table while the same TV program that his family always watches is playing in the background. And then you'll see him encounter those same things again in other episodes. Scenes develop more naturally in this show than perhaps in anything else I've ever seen. The dialogue is very true to life. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes for something to happen, and sometimes it won't be until a long, awkward pause occurs that someone says something that's worth paying attention to. The Flowers of Evil does a fantastic job of capturing the banality of this guy's world and how out of place he feels in it. Almost every shot of him walking is contrasted with how vacant and quiet and desolate the town is that he's in, and how foreign it all is to him, as though the setting itself is a metaphor for the scale of his loneliness. There is legitimate cinematography and artistry and symbolism in this show that you don't always find in anime. It's one of the reasons why I still remember this show 4.5 years after I've seen it, because it really is different. That being said, I do need to say that the show is too slow sometimes. I don't mind when things are slow. I'm that weird guy who likes that the final 3 minutes of an NFL game can take 20 minutes sometimes. I enjoy marinating in things when it helps build up the suspense. But there are times here where certain scenes go on way too long. For example, there's an instance in one of the episodes where Kasuga and this girl are walking home together, and you watch them walk while hearing nothing but ambient music for 6 minutes. I don't mind watching things that take a while, but I do mind when things can be edited better, and there is no reason why that chapter in this story couldn't have been 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long, 4 minutes long, or 5 minutes long. And even that is probably me being generous. I can give the show the benefit of the doubt most of the time, but if you watch it, there are some scenes in it where your finger is going to be hovering over the fast forward button, which is bad, because you should never be taken out of the experience like that. You should never find yourself thinking, damn, this is taking forever. Come on, walk home already. So, The Flowers of Evil has a lot of positives to it. It gets major points for creativity. But I think I hate it. There are things that happen in this story, besides the tempo, that are infuriating. And every time I would start to think, maybe I'm getting into this. Maybe this is really good. Something would happen that would make my head explode. It was as though the show was actively trying to keep me from liking it. Which is why, for all the compliments I've given it, I would have a very hard time ever recommending this to someone without at least including a boatload of qualifiers. Early on, we're introduced to Kasuga, and we see that he's very into this odd poetry book that he recently discovered called The Flowers of Evil, which is a real book, by the way, which is all about sex and existentialism or whatever, and he's really into it. And he has friends, but they're barely his friends. He doesn't really relate to any of them. They're just people that he knows because he sits near them in class. The thing that really consumes his life, more than even that book, is this girl in class named Psyche, who he has a massive crush on. She's like the most popular girl in school, she's the hottest girl in school, and she has the highest grades of anyone in class. She is in a different league than Kasuga. Or at least you'd think. So, the first episode is plodding along, and we're seeing how incredibly tedious Kasuga's life is, and all the while, there's this gloomy, ominous music playing in the background, like this is the prelude to a mass murder or something. And at the end of the episode, Kasuga's the last person to leave class, and just before he leaves, he notices that Psyche has left her knapsack of gym clothes on the floor. And right as he spots this, and is thinking something bad, the episode ends with a close-up of a metaphorical, one-eyed, evil-looking flower, while the outro begins playing, and the outro consists of a woman reading passages from The Flowers of Evil in a distorted robot voice, while uncomfortably off-tuned band music plays behind her. Like I said, it's a really weird show, and all of this was so bizarre to me that even though I wasn't necessarily convinced that I liked the first episode, I was so intrigued that I had to keep watching. I had to know where it was going with this. If nothing else, it piqued my curiosity. Next episode, Kasuga does indeed follow through and steals Psyche's gym clothes and takes them home with him, which is incredibly creepy, but he immediately regrets it, so I could kind of cut him some slack because he's a dumb teenager who's going through puberty, and at least he wasn't lustily in love with Psyche so much as he puts her on a pedestal. It's still gross and uncool, but he's like 14. People do dumb things when they're 14. Unfortunately for Kasuga, the girl who sits behind him in class, named Nakamura, spots him stealing Psyche's gym clothes, and over the course of the series, she proceeds to blackmail Kasuga by telling him that she'll blab to everyone about what he did unless he submits himself to various degrees of humiliation for her benefit. And Nakamura is a horrible sociopath. She has no friends, she doesn't try in school, everyone is afraid of her, she swears at her teacher, and she is upfront with the fact that she has no feelings for Kasuga. She doesn't like him, she calls him her doll, she insults him constantly. Her only interest in him is that she knows that he's a total pushover and that she can bend him to his will with the information that she has. She is a monster, but Kasuga doesn't recognize that she is the big problem in his life, that she is the obstacle that he needs to deal with, and that the clothes thing is secondary. He can't get over his fear that stealing Psyche's clothes will eventually ruin his life, and he's not smart enough to realize, A, that he has all the proof and that he could get rid of it anytime he wants, B, that no one would believe Nakamura on her word alone because everyone in class thinks she's crazy, and C, that Nakamura would lose all interest in him and leave him alone if he just stood up for himself, because she's only interested in people who degrade themselves for her pleasure. But he never puts that together, and on the surface, that makes Kasuga an extremely difficult person to root for, because he is a dumb, naive wimp. Except, as someone who has gone through depression issues and anxiety issues and obsessive-compulsive issues, I know what it's like to have so little self-confidence and so little respect for yourself, and to be so consumed with the fear of how everything is terrible, or how no one likes you, or how every minor error that you commit will one day bring about catastrophic doom, that I related to Kasuga, much more than I wish I did. Especially when you combine whatever he's dealing with the fact that he's also a shy, nerdy teen who hasn't figured out how to talk to people yet. And so, as subservient as he is, and he's so meek that he literally lets Nakamura strip him naked on multiple occasions and wear Psyche's gym clothes underneath his normal clothes, I couldn't help but empathize with him. To a point. As all this is going on, as Nakamura is forcing him to hang out with her and more or less let her run his life, Psyche expresses interest in Kasuga, and the two of them begin to have a relationship, much to everyone's confusion, because she has her act together in a way that he simply doesn't. And even her friends are like, why are you dating him? What do you see in him? And Kasuga finds that he enjoys spending time with her and interacting with her, and she herself is interested in learning more about him, and she even commits herself to reading his creepy-ass book of poetry. She's insanely nice. She is the perfect girlfriend to him. And Nakamura tries to break them up, tries to convince Kasuga that he's too much of a pervert, that he's damaged goods, and that Psyche will one day realize what a horrible loser he is. And she convinces him to break into school in the middle of the night and destroy their homeroom and leave Psyche's gym clothes in the middle of the destroyed classroom like some sort of totem, which is not defensible, which is insanely messed up. And this is where the premise of the show begins to disintegrate, because Psyche, who is smart, catches on pretty quickly that Kasuga and Nakamura were behind this, and she tells him this and forgives him. She says, hey, I don't know why you did this. I don't know why you stole my gym clothes. I don't know what's going on with you, but if you just talk to me, it's okay. I'm sure you have a good reason or something. I'm paraphrasing. So, Kasuga wins the lottery here. The girlfriend, who he was lucky to have to begin with, decides to stay with him even after she's learned that he's been doing these traumatic, disturbing things with her gym clothes. This should have been the end of all his issues. There's nothing Nakamura could blackmail him with anymore, and it turns out that Psyche, for whatever reason, doesn't even care. But, because he's an idiot, and because he's so freaked out that she knows what he did, Kasuga decides to attempt to try to run away from town on a bicycle with Nakamura in the middle of a thunderstorm. Psyche, who is now very concerned for her boyfriend, manages to track him and Nakamura down on the side of a road, on top of a hill, where it's raining cats and dogs, and they're soaked, they don't even have an umbrella. And Psyche still is like, hey, let's just go home, let's forget about this. I care about you, Kasuga, I want to learn more about you, no matter what I find out. It's okay, let's just move on from this, let's just get out of the rain, come on. Now, before I tell you how Kasuga responded to this, let me preface this by saying that I don't ask for much from characters. They don't have to share my religion, my politics, my sexuality, my philosophy. They don't have to be smart. They don't have to be nice. They can even be bad people sometimes. I can roll with pretty much anybody so long as they are relatable, so long as they do things that make sense for them and that we would do if we were them in their situation. My one stipulation, my one rule, if I can even call it that, is that characters have to be willing to accept things that are good, that they want to happen when there are no drawbacks. Like, if a movie is about a guy who wants to win a Rolls Royce, and then they win a Rolls Royce, and that person has said that they are fine with winning a Rolls Royce in this manner, they need to accept the Rolls Royce for me to take that movie seriously. To get back to the Flowers of Evil, Psyche has comforted Kasuga and said nice things to him and calmed him down, and Nakamura is like, "You're boring me, Kasuga. I'm going away." She turns to leave on her bike, and Kasuga, in a fit of insanity, runs after her to stop her. And Psyche still is like, "Okay, I really don't understand what's going on with you. I don't know why you're hanging around her. Am I not enough? What are you doing? I'm trying to do everything I can for you, man. But I'm going to give you one last shot, because I do care about you. You can choose her, or you can choose me, but you gotta choose." So this is the easiest decision in history. It's a choice between the mean, sociopathic, crazy girl who's been tormenting him, who doesn't like him, who insults him constantly, who's actively trying to ruin his life, and who he's not into, or the extremely nice, extremely patient girl who he's incredibly attracted to, who cares about him and genuinely wants a relationship with him in spite of the creepy things he's done, who's chased him down in the pouring rain, who's smarter than him, who's more popular than him, and who he likes being around. Kasuga screams and tells them that he can't choose between them, he can't choose either of them, in a tirade that effectively ends his relationship with Psyche. I had been very patient and forgiving with this character up to this point, but this was unimaginable to me. It'd be one thing if he said that he didn't think he deserved Psyche, or if he found her underwhelming compared to his dream version of her, or even if he was like, "I just can't handle a relationship right now, I can't be around you, I'm so sorry." For him to not be able to distinguish between the love of his life and as horrible a person as humanly possible, that goes beyond depression or anxiety or shyness or puberty or whatever it is that's affecting him. It's about common sense. It's about basic decision making. This story only works if we can connect with the main character even as he's doing things like stealing someone's shorts that we ourselves would never do. Or at least I hope so. In fact, everything about this show is predicated on us finding commonality with him as he's struggling to figure out what to do. But the show screws up because the two potential love interests for him, and that's what Nakamura becomes, are so radically different from each other, where one girl is so nice and understanding that she's almost too good to be true, and the other girl is so pathologically cruel and deranged that she's borderline psychotic, that the premise becomes irrelevant. They present the main character with a decision that's so easy, that's so obvious, that to squander it is to make him unrelatable and unsympathetic and frankly unlikable, given all the things he's done and the myriad of chances he's had to get out of the situation that he created for himself. Chances that would almost certainly not be presented to him in real life. So, at this point, there were only a few episodes remaining in the series, and I don't want to say I'd checked out of the show, but I was no longer invested in the main character. The only way he could even begin to redeem himself is if he regretted his decision, which would not only be natural, but is something I would expect from anybody who had distanced themselves from someone they ostensibly cared for, even if they were totally in the right, let alone someone with as many inner doubts as he has. But Kasuga doesn't focus on that. He stays in a depressed stupor, even though this was all totally avoidable, and he actually goes the other way. He makes the conscious decision to chase down Nakamura and beg her to start hanging around him again. The Flowers of Evil ends with a flash forward showing a montage of future things that Kasuga has done to try to appeal himself to her. There's a shot at one point of him being in a hut and he's burning people's underwear that I guess he stole, and there are shots of Nakamura swinging a bat at him, and shots of a knife being wielded, and someone bleeding, and of Psyche crying, and the police investigating him, and then the final seconds of this show are spent with Kasuga asking Nakamura to make a contract with him, and then there's a close-up of the evil-looking flower again, and then text pops up that says, "End of Part 1. It is an atrocious ending. this show could have salvaged itself, even after Kasuga's decision, if it had ended the moment after he found himself alone, because then the show could have stood for something. It could have served as a cautionary tale for what can happen to you if you have so little self-respect and you're so hindered by your mental afflictions that you wind up essentially ruining your own life out of fear that you're going to ruin your own life. There'd be something there that you could point to and say, yes, there was a purpose to watching him torture himself like this. There's a moral here. But it throws that away. It becomes this self-indulgent exercise where Kasuga is more or less destined to sabotage himself in increasingly inexcusable ways, and the show wants us to go along with this. It expects us to want to know how much further he's willing to debase himself for the amusement of a sociopath, and it doesn't realize that him preferencing Nakamura over Psyche was already the point of no return. There's no coming back from that. There's no way to identify with someone who is choosing, of their own volition, without regrets, to do this to themselves. And yet, the show is so convinced that we're still with him that it dangles a future season of him ruining himself to us. And it's been almost 5 years since The Flowers of Evil was released, and there's no guarantee that there will be a sequel series. The show hasn't even been dubbed after all these years. But even if there is one, I would have no desire to watch it because it'd be pointless. Like, it's obvious that things are just going to turn out even more horribly for him, so why would I invest myself again in the story of someone who has almost no redeeming qualities and who doesn't even want good things to happen to him? Also, for what it's worth, the show is based on a manga that's finished, so if you really want to know what happens to Kasuga, and you can't wait around for The Flowers of Evil 2, you can go check it out right now, if you feel like making yourself depressed for the evening. So, all in all, it's hard to summarize my thoughts on the show coherently. I hate the way it wraps up, I hate the direction it goes in, but I also can't ignore that this weird, obscure anime show has occupied a place in my mind, to the point that I still remembered what happened in it all these years later. I can't decide if The Flowers of Evil is a horrible show that just so happens to have some artistic qualities to it, and accidentally comes close to being brilliant, or if it's a good show that just so happens to go off the deep end. The fact that it ends in a cliffhanger ending and that I don't want to find out what happens next tells me that I'd almost certainly give it a thumbs down if I'd have to give it a grade, but it does have some positive aspects. It's either the best awful thing I've ever seen, or it's the worst good thing I've ever seen. But it's worth something to me, in spite of its imperfections. So, I guess that matters, even if I don't want it to.